Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. So this happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still getting a kick out of how it all played out. I figured this community would appreciate the story since it involves some pretty satisfying malicious compliance. First, let me give you some background. I'm what you might call a quiet millionaire. I own a property management company that I built up over the past 15 years, and we handle about 200 rental properties across 3 counties. Most people would never guess it, though, because I live in a pretty modest house in a nice suburban neighborhood. It's a 3-bedroom ranch that I bought 12 years ago for way under market value because it needed work. I fixed it up myself, and it's been perfect for my needs. The thing is, I have this hobby that tends to raise eyebrows. I restore classic cars, not as a business just because I love the work and the history behind these vehicles. At any given time, I've got 4 to 6 cars in various stages of restoration. My garage can fit 4 vehicles comfortably, and I have a wide driveway that can handle 2 more. The cars are always clean, never leaking fluids, and I keep everything organized and professional looking. For over a decade, this setup worked perfectly. My neighbors knew what I did and never had complaints. I'd get compliments on whatever car I was working on, and occasionally someone would stop by to chat about a particularly interesting project. The HOA never bothered me either. I followed all the rules about keeping vehicles in good condition and not working on them during restricted hours. Then, about 8 months ago, everything changed. The neighborhood had some turnover on the HOA board after the previous president moved away. A new guy took over, and from day one, he made it clear he wanted to elevate the standards of our community. This new president lives in one of the bigger houses about 4 streets over from me. Beautiful place, probably worth 3 times what mine is. He drives a brand new luxury sedan and his wife has a matching SUV. Perfect lawn, perfectly trimmed bushes, the whole 9 yards. The kind of guy who definitely judges people by their house size and car brands. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was heading out to grab coffee when I noticed a white envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside was an official HOA notice stating that I was in violation of Section 12.3 of the community bylaws regarding excessive vehicle storage and potential commercial activity. I read through the thing twice, confused. According to the notice, someone had reported that I was running an unauthorized automotive repair business from my home. It claimed that the constant rotation of vehicles and frequent mechanical work constituted a commercial enterprise that violated our residential zoning. The fine was $250 due within 10 days. If I didn't comply by removing the excess vehicles, I'd face additional daily fines of $50 per vehicle over the allowable limit of 2 cars per residence. Here's the thing though. I checked our HOA covenants when I first moved in, and there's no rule limiting residents to 2 vehicles. The actual rule states that all vehicles must be registered, insured, and in good working condition. It also prohibits vehicles from being parked on grass or blocking sidewalks. I was well within compliance on all counts. I decided to handle this diplomatically. I called the HOA management company and spoke with their representative. She was actually pretty helpful and agreed that the violation notice seemed questionable. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. 2 days later, she called back with an apology. Apparently, the new HOA president had issued the notice directly without going through proper channels. She said she'd spoken with him and explained the actual bylaws, and that I shouldn't receive any more notices. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The following week, I came home from a business trip to find bright orange violation stickers plastered across the windshields of 3 of my cars. Not just any cars either. They'd targeted my 1969 Camaro SS, my 1965 Mustang convertible, and my work truck. All 3 were legally parked in my own driveway. The stickers were a pain to remove and left residue on the glass. I was starting to get annoyed, but I still wanted to handle this properly. I took photos of everything and called the HOA management company again. This time, the representative sounded frustrated. She told me that the HOA president had insisted on immediate action regarding my property, claiming I was becoming a neighborhood liability. She tried to explain that sticking violation notices on someone's private vehicles without proper documentation was potentially illegal, but he'd overruled her. She suggested I attend the next board meeting to address this directly. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early and brought a folder with photos of my property, copies of all my vehicle registrations, and a printout of the relevant HOA bylaws. There were about a dozen residents in attendance, plus 5 board members. The HOA president, let's call him the president since I'm keeping names out of this, was exactly what I expected. Mid-50s, expensive suit despite this being a casual evening meeting, and that particular brand of arrogance that comes with a little bit of authority and a lot of assumptions. When it came time for resident concerns, I stood up and calmly explained the situation. I showed the photos of my property, demonstrated that all my vehicles were properly registered and maintained, and pointed out that the bylaws didn't support the violations I'd received. The president barely looked at my documentation. He leaned back in his chair and said that regardless of technicalities, my property was generating complaints from other residents about excessive automotive activity. He claimed that having multiple project cars created an appearance of commercial activity that was inappropriate for our neighborhood's character. I asked what specific complaints had been filed and by whom. He said that was confidential information, but assured me that multiple concerned neighbors had reached out. Here's where things got interesting. One of the other residents in attendance, an elderly woman who lives 2 houses down from me, spoke up. She said she'd been watching this situation develop and wanted to voice her support for me. She mentioned that in 12 years, I'd been nothing but a considerate neighbor, that my property was always well maintained, and that she'd never heard anyone complain about my cars. 2 other neighbors echoed similar sentiments. They pointed out that I kept reasonable working hours, never created noise or pollution issues, and that my vintage cars were actually an interesting addition to the neighborhood. The president looked annoyed by this support. He dismissed their comments by saying that property values and community standards were more important than individual preferences. He then made a statement that really rubbed me the wrong way. He said that some residents needed to understand that just because they could afford to live in our neighborhood didn't mean they understood what it took to maintain its prestige. He suggested that people who played with old cars might be more comfortable in a different type of community, somewhere with more appropriate zoning for hobbyist activities. The implication was crystal clear. He was suggesting that I didn't belong there because my house wasn't big enough and my hobby wasn't refined enough for his vision of the neighborhood. I kept my cool, though. I simply stated that I believed I was in full compliance with all HOA rules and that I'd appreciate a formal review of the specific bylaws I was allegedly violating. I requested that any future violations be issued through proper channels with appropriate documentation. The president said the board would take my request under consideration, but that in the meantime, the existing violations stood and payment was still due within the original time frame. The meeting ended without resolution, and I went home more frustrated than before, but I also started thinking about this differently. If the president wanted to play hardball over HOA rules and property values, maybe it was time to get a better understanding of exactly who I was dealing with. That weekend, I did something I probably should have done years ago. I pulled up the property management database for my company and cross-referenced it with the addresses of all the HOA board members. What I found was absolutely fascinating. The president lived at an address that looked familiar. I searched our rental portfolio, and there it was, a 4-bedroom colonial that we'd been managing for 8 years. The owner was an investment group from out of state, and we handled everything from tenant screening to maintenance coordination. I dug deeper into the lease records. The president had been renting this house for just over 3 years. His current lease was set to expire in 2 months, and according to our notes, he'd been a consistently difficult tenant. Multiple complaints about minor issues, unreasonable demands for immediate repairs on non-emergency items, and a pattern of trying to negotiate lower rent every time his lease came up for renewal. But here's the really interesting part. 2 other board members were also renting properties that we managed. One lived in a townhouse that we'd been managing for 5 years, and another was in a single-family home that had been in our portfolio for almost a decade. I sat back in my office chair and started to smile. These 3 guys had been making my life miserable over my car hobby, all while living in houses that I essentially controlled. The irony was almost too perfect. I decided to dig even deeper into the situation. I pulled the rental histories for all 3 properties and found some very interesting details. The president's house had several maintenance issues that were getting expensive. The HVAC system was 12 years old and would likely need replacement within the next 2 years. The roof had been patched multiple times and was due for a complete overhaul. The property owner had been asking us to evaluate whether the current rent was sufficient to justify keeping it as a rental rather than selling. The townhouse tenant had a lease that was month to month after his initial year expired. He'd been a decent tenant, but nothing special, and the property was in a hot market where we could easily increase rent by 30% with a new tenant. The 3rd board member was renting a house where we'd been planning to do major renovations. The property owner wanted to upgrade to luxury finishes and target higher-end tenants, which would mean a significant rent increase or finding new tenants who could afford the improved property. I spent the next week thinking about how to handle this situation. I could have immediately gone nuclear and started eviction proceedings or non-renewal notices, but that seemed like overkill. I'm a businessman, not a vindictive person, and I wanted to handle this professionally. Instead, I decided to let the HOA situation play out a little longer while I prepared my options. Right on schedule, I received another violation notice the following week. This time, the fine had increased to $400, and it included a warning that continued non-compliance could result in a lien being placed against my property. The notice also included a new accusation. Someone had apparently reported that I was storing hazardous automotive chemicals on my property without proper permits. This was completely fabricated. I keep a small amount of car wax and basic cleaning supplies in my garage, nothing remotely hazardous or unusual. I realized the president was escalating this conflict intentionally, probably hoping I'd either pay up and comply with his unreasonable demands or get frustrated enough to move away. He had no idea that he was picking a fight with someone who had significant leverage over his living situation. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I returned from a client meeting to find that someone had left a formal notice of intent to file lien on my front door. The document claimed that I owed over $1,500 in accumulated fines, and that failure to pay within 10 days would result in legal action against my property. Attached to the notice was a handwritten note that read, "Some of us actually contribute to this community's property values. Maybe it's time to find a neighborhood that better suits your lifestyle." The note wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting from other HOA documents. The president had made this personal, and he'd grossly underestimated who he was dealing with. That evening, I called my property management team and scheduled a comprehensive review of all 3 rental properties. I also asked our legal department to prepare standard lease non-renewal notices and updated market rate rental agreements for each property. The timing was perfect. The president's lease expired in 6 weeks, which meant I needed to provide 30 days notice if I wasn't planning to renew. The other 2 leases had different terms, but both could be addressed within the next 60 days. I spent the weekend reviewing market comparisons and recent rental rates in the area. Property values had increased significantly over the past 2 years, which meant I had solid justification for substantial rent increases on all 3 properties. For the president's house, I determined that the current market rate was about $800 per month higher than his current rent. Given the upcoming maintenance needs, I calculated that we'd actually need to charge closer to $1,000 more per month to make the property profitable for the owner. The townhouse was even more dramatic. The tenant was paying almost 40% below current market rates, and we had a waiting list of qualified applicants willing to pay premium rent for that location. The third property offered the most interesting opportunity. The owner had been wanting to renovate and upgrade to luxury finishes. If we moved forward with that plan, the monthly rent would nearly double, transforming it into one of the premium properties in the area. By Monday morning, I had a complete strategy mapped out. I instructed my property management team to begin the formal processes for all 3 properties, but to proceed through normal business channels without mentioning any connection to the HOA situation. The first notice went out on Tuesday. The president received a routine lease review and market analysis letter informing him that his lease would not be renewed at the current terms when it expired in 35 days. The letter explained that recent market changes had made his current rent unsustainable, and offered him the option to sign a new lease at the updated market rate. The new rate was $950 per month higher than his current payment. The letter was perfectly professional and included comparable rental data to justify the increase. It came from our leasing office with no indication of my personal involvement. As far as he knew, this was just an unfortunate coincidence of market forces. The second notice went out on Wednesday to the townhouse tenant. His month-to-month lease would be terminated in 30 days, with the option to sign a new annual lease at current market rates. The rent increase was substantial, but justified by recent comparables in the area. The third property owner had already approved the renovation plan, so that tenant received notice that major improvements would begin in 60 days, requiring him to either relocate temporarily or find alternative housing. Given the scope of the renovations, it was essentially an invitation to move out. I waited to see how this would play out at the next HOA meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday. I had a feeling it was going to be an interesting evening. The week leading up to the meeting was remarkably quiet on the HOA front. No new violation notices, no orange stickers, no threatening letters. I wondered if the rental situation was starting to create some distraction for the board members. Thursday evening arrived, and I showed up to the meeting with the same folder of documentation I'd brought before. This time, though, I also brought a thin portfolio containing some additional paperwork that I might or might not need, depending on how the evening went. The meeting started normally with routine business and budget discussions. When they reached the agenda item about ongoing violations, the president looked directly at me with what I can only describe as smug confidence. He announced that despite multiple attempts to work with me on resolving the vehicle violations, I had continued to ignore HOA rules and accumulate fines. He said the board had voted to proceed with placing a lien against my property if payment wasn't received within 48 hours. He then made a speech about how some residents seemed to think that HOA rules didn't apply to them, and that the board had a responsibility to protect property values for residents who actually cared about maintaining community standards. The whole thing was clearly designed to humiliate me and force me to either pay up or face legal consequences. He obviously expected me to either write a check on the spot or storm out in anger. Instead, I stood up calmly and said that I appreciated the board's concern about community standards and property values. I mentioned that I'd been doing some research myself about our neighborhood's real estate market and had discovered some very interesting trends. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a few sheets of paper. I explained that property values had indeed risen significantly over the past few years, which was great news for homeowners, but created some challenges for residents who were renting rather than owning their homes. The president interrupted me and said that property values and rental markets weren't relevant to my HOA violations. He suggested that I either pay the fines or prepare for legal action. That's when I decided it was time to play my cards. I looked directly at him and said that I found it interesting how passionate he was about property values, especially considering that he'd soon need to find a new place to live since his landlord had decided not to renew his lease. The color drained from his face. I continued by mentioning that it was unfortunate when market forces made it difficult for renters to stay in neighborhoods they'd grown attached to, but that's simply how real estate markets worked. I then casually mentioned that 2 other board members were also facing similar situations with their rental properties, and expressed sympathy for how disruptive it must be to deal with housing uncertainty, while also trying to manage HOA responsibilities. The room had gone completely silent. I could see the other 2 board members starting to realize what was happening, but the president was still trying to process how I knew about his living situation. He stammered something about his housing arrangements being private matters that had no connection to HOA business. I agreed completely and suggested that's exactly why we should focus on actual HOA violations rather than personal vendettas. I pulled out the photos of my property again and offered to have an independent inspector verify that all my vehicles were properly maintained, legally parked, and fully compliant with our community covenants. I suggested that if they could identify any actual violations, I'd be happy to address them immediately. I also mentioned that if they couldn't identify specific violations, then perhaps the accumulated fines were inappropriate and should be reversed. One of the other board members, who wasn't affected by the rental situation, spoke up. She said she'd reviewed the original complaints and hadn't found any documentation supporting the violations that had been issued. She suggested that maybe they should table the lien discussion until they could do a more thorough review. The president tried to maintain control of the situation, but it was clear he was rattled. He insisted that multiple residents had complained about my property, but when pressed for specifics, he couldn't provide any concrete examples. Another resident in attendance mentioned that she'd canvassed several neighbors after the previous meeting, and nobody she'd spoken with had any complaints about my cars or property maintenance. In fact, several people had mentioned that they enjoyed seeing the classic cars and appreciated that I kept everything clean and organized. The president was clearly frustrated and started making veiled threats about pursuing legal action regardless of community support. That's when I decided to be more direct about the situation. I stood up again and addressed the entire room. I explained that I'd been researching property values and rental markets because I own a property management company, and that it was part of my regular business to track these trends. I mentioned that I'd discovered that several HOA board members were actually renting their homes rather than owning them, which wasn't a problem at all, but it did give me a different perspective on their concerns about property values. I suggested that anyone who was worried about housing costs or rental market pressures might want to focus their energy on more constructive activities rather than creating artificial controversies with neighbors. The president realized that I wasn't just making lucky guesses about his situation. He asked directly how I knew about his lease status and whether I'd been investigating board members without their permission. I explained that I hadn't investigated anyone personally, but that as a property manager, I was familiar with rental properties throughout the area. I mentioned that when someone starts making threats about property values and community standards, it's natural to wonder whether they actually have a long-term stake in the neighborhood's success. At this point, one of the other affected board members spoke up. He asked if I was implying that renters couldn't serve effectively on HOA boards because that would be discrimination based on housing status. I clarified that I had no problem with renters serving on boards, but I did think it was problematic when board members used their positions to harass neighbors over fabricated violations. I suggested that anyone doing that might want to consider whether they were really acting in the community's best interests. The meeting was starting to get tense, with board members whispering among themselves and other residents asking questions about what was really going on. The president called for a 15-minute recess to allow the board to discuss the situation privately. During the break, several neighbors came over to talk with me. They were curious about the rental property connection and supportive of my position on the car violations. A few mentioned that they'd been wondering about the president's aggressive approach to HOA enforcement since it seemed disproportionate to any actual problems in the neighborhood. When the meeting resumed, the board's tone had completely changed. The president announced that they'd decided to table the lien discussion pending a comprehensive review of the violations that had been issued. He said they wanted to ensure that all enforcement actions were properly documented and justified before taking any legal steps. He also mentioned that the board would be reviewing their overall approach to community standards to make sure they were being applied fairly and consistently. I thanked them for their reconsideration and offered again to work with them on addressing any legitimate concerns about my property. I suggested that clear communication and reasonable enforcement would benefit everyone in the community. The meeting ended without any resolution on the fines, but with an agreement that the board would provide a detailed response within 2 weeks about which violations they intended to pursue and what documentation supported their position. As I packed up my materials, the president approached me privately. He was clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain his authority. He said that he hoped we could resolve the HOA issues professionally, and that he trusted there wouldn't be any retaliation related to unrelated business matters. I told him that I completely agreed that HOA business and property management were separate issues, and that I handled all my professional responsibilities according to standard business practices and market conditions. I mentioned that I hoped he'd be able to resolve his housing situation successfully, and that if he needed any recommendations for other rental properties in the area, he was welcome to contact me. The look on his face was priceless. He'd just realized that not only did I control his current housing, but I was also one of the major property managers in the area. Any rental property he looked at might very well be in my portfolio. Over the next week, things moved quickly on multiple fronts. The HOA board contacted me to schedule a property inspection, which I welcomed. They sent out an independent inspector who confirmed that all my vehicles were properly maintained, legally parked, and fully compliant with community covenants. The inspector's report noted that my property was actually above average in terms of maintenance and organization compared to other homes in the neighborhood. He found no evidence of commercial activity, hazardous materials, or any other violations. Meanwhile, my property management team was fielding calls from all 3 affected board members about their rental situations. The president had requested a meeting to discuss his lease renewal. The townhouse tenant wanted to negotiate a smaller rent increase, and the 3rd board member was asking about delaying the renovation timeline. I instructed my team to handle all requests through standard business channels with decisions based purely on property management best practices and owner requirements. No special consideration, either positive or negative, because of the HOA situation. The president's situation was the most challenging from a business perspective. The property owner had been subsidizing below market rent for 3 years, and recent maintenance costs had made it clear that the current rental rate wasn't sustainable. The upcoming HVAC and roof expenses alone would cost more than the annual rent shortfall. After reviewing the numbers, my team determined that the property would need to rent for at least $800 more per month to be financially viable for the owner. Anything less would require the owner to either sell the property or accept ongoing losses. We offered the president a new lease at the market rate with the option to sign a 2-year agreement that would lock in the rent without increases for the extended term. It was actually a reasonable offer considering the rapid rent growth in the area, but it was still a substantial increase from his current payment. The townhouse situation was more straightforward. The tenant had been paying below market rent on a month-to-month basis, which gave us flexibility to adjust to current rates. We offered him a new annual lease at market rate, which was still competitive compared to similar properties in the area. The 3rd property required the most complex decision. The renovation plan had been approved months earlier and was already scheduled with contractors. The improvements would add significant value but would also justify a substantial rent increase. We offered the tenant the option to sign a new lease after renovations were complete, but at the post-renovation market rate. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, I received the board's formal response about my violations. The letter was remarkably different in tone from their previous communications. It acknowledged that the independent inspection had found no evidence of actual violations and that their previous enforcement actions had been based on incomplete information. They formally rescinded all previous fines and violation notices related to my vehicles and property. They also implemented new procedures requiring documented evidence and independent verification before any future violations could be issued. The letter was signed by all 5 board members, including the president, though I suspected he wasn't thrilled about the reversal. Around the same time, I started hearing back from my tenants about their lease situations. The townhouse tenant decided to sign a new annual agreement at the market rate. It was a significant increase, but he'd grown attached to the property and location, and he acknowledged that the rent was still reasonable compared to other options in the area. The 3rd board member chose not to renew after the renovations. He said the post-renovation rent would be outside his budget, and he'd found a different property that better met his needs. It was an amicable parting, and we provided excellent references when he applied for his new rental. The president's response was the most interesting. He initially tried to negotiate a smaller rent increase, proposing to sign a 3-year lease in exchange for keeping his rent closer to the current rate. When my team explained that the property owner had already decided the minimum acceptable rent based on market conditions and upcoming expenses, he asked for additional time to consider his options. 3 days before his lease expired, he informed us that he wouldn't be renewing and would be moving out at the end of the month. He said he'd found a property in a different neighborhood that better fit his budget and lifestyle preferences. I never found out exactly where he moved, but I heard through neighborhood gossip that it was a smaller house about 20 minutes away from our community. Several residents mentioned that the HOA board was much more collaborative and reasonable after his departure. The new HOA president was elected from among the remaining board members, and she immediately implemented a more transparent approach to community management. She established clear procedures for violation reports, required documented evidence before issuing fines, and created a resident feedback process for policy changes. The change in HOA culture was remarkable. Instead of looking for problems to enforce, the board started focusing on community improvements and resident services. They organized neighborhood events, improved common area maintenance, and created committees to address specific concerns like traffic safety and landscaping. My car situation became a complete non-issue. The new board actually featured my vintage cars in their community newsletter as an example of residents pursuing interesting hobbies while maintaining property values. They noted that my restoration projects were always clean, organized, and conducted during appropriate hours. I ended up getting requests from other residents who were curious about car restoration or wanted advice on their own automotive projects. A few neighbors started stopping by on weekends to check out whatever I was working on, and I discovered that several other residents had similar interests that they'd been keeping quiet about. The 3 rental properties all worked out well from a business perspective. The townhouse tenant turned into one of our most reliable long-term renters, and he actually thanked us for forcing him to commit to an annual lease because it provided him with rent stability in a rapidly changing market. The renovated house attracted premium tenants who appreciated the luxury finishes and were willing to pay top market rent for the upgraded property. The improvements added significant value and transformed it into one of the most desirable rentals in our portfolio. The president's former house required some initial marketing effort to find new tenants at the higher rent, but we eventually placed a young professional couple who were thrilled to find a well-maintained property in such a desirable neighborhood. They signed a 2-year lease and have been excellent tenants. Looking back on the whole situation, I'm struck by how differently things could have played out. If the president had approached me respectfully about any genuine concerns, we probably could have worked out a reasonable solution that satisfied everyone. Instead, his assumption that I was some kind of second-class resident who could be bullied into compliance created a conflict that ultimately cost him his housing. The irony is that his obsession with property values and community standards led him to harass someone who is actually contributing significantly to both. My property management company helps maintain stable rental income for dozens of property owners in the area, which supports overall market values. My own property is well maintained and adds character to the neighborhood with carefully restored classic cars. But beyond the financial aspects, I think this situation illustrates something important about community leadership. Effective HOA boards focus on genuine problems and work collaboratively with residents to find solutions. They don't create artificial problems as excuses to exercise authority over people they don't think belong in the neighborhood. The president's biggest mistake was assuming that someone living in a modest house and working on old cars couldn't possibly have any real influence or resources. He never bothered to find out who I actually was or what my background might be. He just saw surface appearances and decided I was an easy target. In business, I've learned that you can never judge someone's capabilities or connections based on superficial observations. The quiet person in the small office might be the decision maker for major investments. The modestly dressed individual at a networking event might control significant resources. The neighbor with the unassuming house might own half the rental properties in your area. I think there's also a lesson here about choosing your battles carefully. The president escalated a minor disagreement into a major conflict because he was more interested in asserting dominance than solving problems. If he'd focused on actual community issues rather than manufactured grievances, he might still be living in a house he couldn't actually afford to own. The HOA situation taught me something about my own neighborhood, too. I'd been living there for 12 years, but had mostly kept to myself, focusing on work and my car projects. The conflict forced me to engage more with other residents, and I discovered that most people were reasonable, friendly, and supportive when they understood the actual facts. The new HOA board has created a much more positive community atmosphere. They organize seasonal social events, coordinate group discounts for services like lawn care and snow removal, and facilitate communication between neighbors on various issues. It's become the kind of neighborhood association that actually adds value rather than just creating bureaucracy. My car hobby has evolved too. What started as a solitary activity has become a way to connect with neighbors who share similar interests. We've started an informal classic car club that meets monthly, and several residents have begun their own restoration projects. The neighborhood has become known in the area for its collection of vintage vehicles, which actually has attracted positive attention and potentially increased property values. I've also become more involved in HOA governance, not as a board member, but as someone who participates in meetings and provides input on community decisions. My business experience has been helpful in reviewing budgets, evaluating service contracts, and planning long-term maintenance projects. The whole experience reinforced my belief that most conflicts can be resolved through clear communication and mutual respect. When people approach disagreements with curiosity rather than assumption, and focus on solving problems rather than winning battles, amazing things can happen. But sometimes, when someone insists on creating a fight, you have to be prepared to win it decisively. The key is having the patience to let them dig their own hole while you prepare your response carefully. 6 months later, I'm still enjoying my cars, my modest house, and my quiet millionaire lifestyle. The difference is that now I'm doing it in a neighborhood where people actually appreciate diversity in hobbies, backgrounds, and house sizes. And every time I see a moving truck in front of the president's old house, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is just letting people face the natural consequences of their own poor decisions. The new tenants in that house, by the way, love having a neighbor with interesting cars to look at. They've already asked for recommendations about local automotive services, and we've had several pleasant conversations about their settling in process. It's funny how a change in attitude can transform the entire dynamic of a relationship. I guess the moral of the story is that you never know who you're really dealing with until you take the time to find out. And if you're going to pick a fight with someone, you'd better make sure you understand what resources they might have available to respond. As I was finishing up this post, I realized there was one more detail worth mentioning. Remember how I paid all those HOA fines into the community fund? Well, those funds go toward neighborhood improvements and property maintenance, which means I essentially paid to improve the value of properties I owned, including the president's rental house. So in the end, even my losses in this situation turned into gains. The president paid higher rent to live in a house that was partially improved with money from the fines he forced me to pay. I have to admit, there's something poetically satisfying about that outcome. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a 1967 Mustang convertible that needs some attention, and I'm going to work on it right in my driveway where everyone can see it. Because sometimes the best way to handle victory is to simply enjoy the freedom to be exactly who you are. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Back when I was working in an FAA facility doing repair and overhaul, we had a boss who wanted to control everything. This boss came to us from the production side and did not understand why we were reactive in our work versus scheduled like production. Repair and overhaul is just that. We repair or overhaul parts that come back from the field, so cannot schedule it more than the customer lets us know it is broken and we say send it in type thing. Not the point, not the compliance, but giving you a little of how the mindset is. Anyway, about a month after said boss comes in, we have a customer representative who is talking to engineering regarding the product I was working on. The customer had a question regarding a specific failure we continued to see and wanted to talk to the technician, me, about it. So engineer brings customer to me, and I answer customer rep's question. Should be easy, right? Wrong. Boss says I did not have the authority to answer the question, and that customer should have been brought to him or quality assurance, QA. At the next morning stand-up, boss reiterates to entire group that no one is to talk to anyone not a part of our company without either boss or QA there for conversation. I asked for this in writing and got an email within minutes after the stand-up. Fast forward about a month, I am not talking to anyone without boss or QA, and we have an ISO 9001 audit. The audit is scheduled, and somehow when the auditor is on the repair floor, no one is around but me, so naturally I get audited. Should be easy, right? Auditor asks me what I'm doing. I reply I am not allowed to talk with personnel who do not belong to my company without my boss or QA present. Auditor asks me if I know who they are. I do. They introduce themselves as they came up to me. I let them know I have been given instructions and cannot talk to them. They ask me if I can show them the instructions. I had sent the email to the printer as soon as I knew I was going to be audited, so asked auditor to please wait 1 minute and went and got the email. Auditor thanks me and leaves. Next morning at stand-up, boss comes in with regional management. Boss apologizes to us technicians and lets us know we are allowed to talk to people from outside the company without boss or QA. I raise my hand. Boss says email has already been sent. Found out from boss's aide. Boss was put on PIP, Personnel Improvement Program, for this. The next one is an entitled people story. My husband and I bought a small house with a bit of land about a decade ago, intending to improve/add on to the house to make it our own. We do not currently have a garage or any outbuildings and are working to build a pole barn in addition to the house. We have a neighbor who literally owns all of the land around our property and has a house double the size of ours along with a pole barn, cabin, and pond. Ever since my husband began the work for our home improvements, we have gotten nothing but complaints from this neighbor. When my husband was clearing trees to make room for the pole barn, this neighbor questioned the property lines and whether or not certain trees were actually his. We made sure to consult the auditor maps well in advance of this and were mocked when we told him that we measured and knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the trees were well within our property lines. He then complained about us cutting down trees in general. We love trees and don't want to cut any down if we don't have to. Unfortunately, it's necessary if we want to have a pole barn for outdoor storage. Also, trees had to be cut down to build this neighbor's buildings, so I found this to be infuriating and audacious on his part. Now, this neighbor is complaining about how our pole barn might displace water and cause flooding on his land. Apparently, unbeknownst to him, his land hasn't flooded in years now because my husband dredged the creek and installed a culvert pipe that allows for better water flow/drainage. He had nothing to say to that when my husband pointed it out. My husband also explained his plans for a certain drainage system that would prevent the issue regardless. My husband works in construction and knows what he's doing. We have the permits, we are within the required number of feet of the property lines, and we've paid to get the property officially surveyed. It's just frustrating to deal with such condescension and selfishness. He has his house with all of his land and buildings. Why can't we make our house the way we want it? Obviously, we are going to do what we want, since it's our property. It would just be nice if we didn't have to deal with this nonsense every step of the way. TLDR, neighbor with big house, multiple outbuildings, and lots of land complaining about what we are doing on our own property to improve and add on to our home. Edited to fix broken paragraphs and provide update below. Update. Thank you all for your advice. We are doing our best to engage as little as possible. We do want to be civil as our children play together. We would love to ignore him and his ridiculous behavior, though he has since submitted multiple complaints to our county which will inevitably inconvenience us with the hassle of explaining the situation to the county officials. We have all the required permits, all of the official surveys, and are doing everything by the book, so our plans will absolutely not change. This man seemingly lives to hinder us in any way possible. The next one is an entitled people story. The open expanse of the countryside has always soothed my soul. There's something about the rolling green hills dotted with trees, the chirping bird songs floating on the breeze, and the golden rays of the sun warming the earth that fills me with a sense of peace. So when I finally achieved my dream of building my own home on a sprawling few acres of land far from the noise and chaos of the city, I felt like I had found my own personal paradise. My name is Mark Hayes, and I've lived on this little slice of heaven for over 10 wonderful years now. Out here, away from the crowds and traffic, I've built a life of comfort and success. I run my own technology company, Haytech Solutions, from my home office inside the large, custom-designed house I had constructed. The crown jewel of my property is the enormous detached garage and workshop, located just a short walk from the main house. Above it, I built a fully furnished guest apartment where friends and family can stay when they visit my rural retreat. Everything was perfectly idyllic until about a year ago when a new neighbor moved into the property next door. John Boyd seemed polite and friendly enough when I first met him, I even invited the 40-something bachelor over for dinner several times after he finished settling into the old farmhouse on his land. But it didn't take long before subtle hints of jealousy and resentment started peeking through John's congenial veneer. I began noticing him staring with narrowed eyes at my manicured lawn, or glaring with thinly veiled envy when friends arrived in their fancy cars for my summer barbecues. The indications were slight, but it became increasingly clear he coveted the success I had achieved out here in the countryside. The real trouble started when I decided to expand my garage workshop by adding another bay and building a small apartment loft above the entire structure. I was eager to have a self-contained space for guests to stay in comfort and privacy. John stopped by the first day of construction, casually mentioning that the garage looked like it now crossed partly over the property line we shared. I assured him the building was well within the boundaries of my land according to the official survey I had done. He merely shrugged and went back home. A few days later, I was stunned to have John show up waving some handwritten documents, claiming they proved he actually owned half of my property, according to an alleged agreement with the previous owner. The whole thing seemed very suspicious, but before I could fully look into the legitimacy of these documents, disaster struck. The very next morning, when I went out to inspect the construction progress, I was shocked to discover John had erected an enormous wooden privacy fence across the entire front side of my garage, completely blocking access to the structure. I was furious. I immediately called the county authorities to report the illegal obstruction on my own land. After tense negotiations, they forced John to grudgingly dismantle the outrageous fence. I wish I could say that was the end of the saga, but sadly John's harassment had only just begun. Exactly 1 week later, I awoke to find a tall iron fence obstructing my garage yet again. This time I didn't hesitate. I called my lawyer to put an end to these antics once and for all. My lawyer rapidly confirmed what I already knew. The documents John produced were entirely fraudulent. We promptly filed a lawsuit against him for harassment and intimidation, presenting my legitimate property deeds clearly defining the boundaries. I also installed security cameras in case John tried anything else. The judge agreed John was clearly in the wrong and ordered him to immediately remove the fence blocking my garage and pay damages for the trouble. But John stubbornly refused to comply. When the county sheriff came to enforce the court order, he found John had barricaded himself inside his house. After an armed standoff lasting hours, John was finally arrested for contempt of court when he tried making a run for it in his pickup truck. As he was carted off to await trial in jail, I breathed a sigh of relief knowing he could no longer cause trouble on my property. Or so I believed. As it turned out, John had one more vindictive trick up his sleeve. During the highly dramatic court trial, it came to light that John had a long history of bullying anyone he perceived as more successful than himself. Former neighbors testified about the vicious feuds he instigated over minor property line disagreements that turned frighteningly aggressive. My lawyer methodically presented ironclad evidence proving John had falsified the documents in a brazen attempt to swindle me out of half of my valuable land. Handwriting experts confirmed John had crudely forged the signatures himself. In the end, the jury unanimously found John guilty of harassment, forgery, trespassing, and contempt of court. The unapologetic John was sentenced to over 3 years in state prison for his disturbing criminal behavior. With this dangerous, unstable man finally off the streets and far away, I proceeded to pick up the pieces of my once peaceful life. I hired security experts to install an imposing, electronically controlled gate across the driveway so no one can ever again obstruct access to my property. I upgraded the security system to include motion sensors and cameras covering every angle. And I replanted the line of trees John had uprooted along our shared boundary in his pathological crusade against me. In the years since, I've heard John was released from prison early for good behavior, but I'm relieved to say he has not shown his face nor caused any more trouble around here. The lessons from this frightening harassment forced me to take precautions, however. I joined the local neighborhood watch and routinely photograph any unusual activity near my borders. With the stillness of the countryside once again my companion, I sometimes wonder if John ever found the help he obviously needed, or if his pathological jealousy still simmers, waiting to boil over upon his next unsuspecting victim. I can only hope that man learned you simply cannot intimidate and bully your way through life at the expense of others. His reign of terror on my doorstep taught me to stand up for myself against anyone trying to take what's rightfully mine. In the end, justice prevailed, and I now rest easy knowing my little slice of paradise is protected. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I used to have a Veterans Disability Pension, VDP, for a hearing defect. It's now merged with my state pension. It was small, and back home it was paid annually. However, I moved to the UK, and this pension was still paid by my government, but now administered by the UK DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, who paid it fortnightly. Some years ago, I was entitled to a disability allowance, DA, because of various issues. At the time, I was diagnosed with diabetes, but was trying to control it with diet, so I got called into the local job center for an interview. Unfortunately, I had a Karen for an interviewer. I'm on the spectrum, but I'm high functioning. This means that I don't suffer fools gladly, and I can be very rules-bound. Firstly, she questions why I hadn't declared the VDP as part of my earnings. I had, but it was in another part of the form. Then she said that I couldn't have diabetes because I wasn't taking any medicine, and as I was telling lies, she would not allow my claim. Now, the DA claim had nothing to do with my diabetes. However, she was stupid to put in her letter of rejection that I didn't have diabetes because I wasn't taking any medicine for it. She also said that they would no longer pay my VDP. I sent a copy of the letter to my High Commission, who said, "Don't worry, they would deal with it." I handed a copy of the letter to my doctor, who was incensed. She complained to the DWP, asking about Karen's medical qualifications. So I got asked to have another interview at around 1 p.m. on a certain day with Karen. I said that I couldn't guarantee attending on that day as I had another appointment that morning. The message back from Karen was, if I didn't attend, my claim would be refused. So going with the flow, I said that I would try to attend, but I might be a little late. So I had my morning appointment, went home, changed, and headed off to the job center. I arrived there at exactly 1 p.m., only to find that Karen had booked an interview room on the first floor instead of the ground floor. There was no lift. To cut a long story short, it took me nearly 15 minutes to haul myself up those stairs, with the help of a guy in a suit who asked why I was trying to get to the first floor. I told him that I had an interview and that Karen, who was seeing me, chose the room. Finally, I reached the room and Karen said, "You're late. I am refusing your claim unless you have a very good reason." So I said to her, "Well, my day has been interesting. You were warned that I had an appointment this morning, and because of it, I might be late." Karen: "I want you to tell me about this appointment and exactly what happened to make you late." Me: "I turned up at the appointment this morning, took my clothes off, and then had two nice young ladies apply lube to my genitals. They then proceeded to conduct a procedure. They asked me to lie down on my side facing the wall, and one of them inserted her fingers into my rectum." Karen: "How dare you talk such filth in front of me? Your case is closed." Suit, who was listening out of sight: "Excuse me, Karen, but you did ask him to tell you about his appointment and exactly what happened to make him late." Suit to me: "How did your prostate examination go?" Me: "More tests, unfortunately." Suit: "And was that the reason you were late?" Me: "No, the supervisor was being vindictive and interviewed me on this floor instead of the ground floor. She knew my claim was because I had breathing problems and couldn't climb stairs. I think she would have claimed that since I made it to the first floor, I was lying and refused the claim." Suit: "I think you are right." Suit to Karen: "You will approve his DLA claim. I had to help him up the stairs, and based on my observations, he qualifies. Both you and your manager will report to me tomorrow at 9 a.m. in my office to explain your actions. If you are late, you will be terminated." Karen, very white-faced: "Yes, sir." Turns out he was an area director that the DWP had sent in to investigate the high level of complaints about that job center. It also turns out that a complaint from a high commissioner about breaching an international agreement is a big deal for the DWP. Who knew? The next one is a petty revenge story. I was working at a Tim Hortons in my youth, think 19, 20 years old, and I prided myself on polite and courteous service. I was always cheerful and tried my best to fill orders promptly. I managed this by telling myself that even the worst customer could just be a normal person on the most terrible day of their life. I usually brightened people's days and saw many grumpy people leave happier because of me, until the Karen came in. I was dealing with a lunch rush, which means for several hours people streamed in as if food and drink had never existed, and would never exist again. So there were a lot of people to get through. A lot. So under these conditions, the Karen showed herself. She was belligerent, rude, and had a truly massive order to fill. Nothing I couldn't handle. However, she had several drinks ordered, think 8 different beverages, and she had 3 dozen donuts, which is fine, nothing out of the ordinary. but she had to have them specifically in a certain order in the boxes, and this took time as she ordered me about. No problem. I've dealt with weirder things while working there. The line, however, was backing up while I was serving her, and her true colors were starting to show as I filled her order. Then we get to check out. I start to ring her up. She changes her order, third time, again, and wants to add 4 sandwiches. I say, "Ma'am, could we ring the drink and donuts through first? Until I ring you through completely, it ties up a cash register." The Karen screeches, "I won't pay more taxes on my order, you won't cheat me!" I stare rather dumbfounded at this logic. I tried to argue with her, saying, "Ma'am, this won't increase your taxes, it's just faster." The Karen interrupts, "No, I won't be cheated, you hear me?" And I shoot a deeply apologetic glance at my coworkers who are now regretfully dealing with a crowd with 1 less cash register. Then I proceed to head to the deli to make her sandwiches as fast as I physically can so I can get back to the counter. The Karen smugly chides and reproaches me while I make her order, telling me, "You're making the sandwich wrong," and tries several times to order me about as if I were a complete idiot. As I'm finishing my second sandwich for this woman, I am getting irritated with her attitude. I, still politely, inform her that I have to assemble the sandwiches in a certain order. I even have a physical chart to follow. I could get fired for not following the chart. She harumphs at me while muttering under her breath about how no one respects their elders anymore, and "duck you," and more angrily, "idiot," when I'm beginning the 4th sandwich. My sunny disposition was leaving me at this point. This woman obviously had no respect for me, thinks I'm incompetent, and doesn't care if she insults me. So impulsively, I came up with a plan as I finished up the 4th and final sandwich. Smacking my head, I say, "Oh, I almost forgot." The Karen grumbles, "Forgot what?" I say, "Well, we have a new promotional offer, and I almost forgot to ask you about it." You see, Tim Hortons has been doing ergonomic studies and has found that right-handed people and left-handed people hold bags differently. The Karen looks interested, so I continue. "So with these findings, they designed ergonomic bags for their customers as a promotional offer. Would you like to participate?" The Karen huffs at me. "Of course I want to participate." I give my best customer service smile and say, "Okay, would you like a left-handed bag or a right-handed bag?" The Karen looks offended. "A right-handed one, of course." I say, "Of course, ma'am," and duck down below the counter to quietly rummage through the completely identical bags I have. I decide to take the whole thing a step further, and I pop back up with a look of pure regret on my face. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, we only have left-handed bags left. Is that okay?" The Karen is upset with this turn of events, but does not wish to lose out on the promotion. "Ugh, fine," she says icily and grabs her order. I ring her through and watch her walk out the door with complete satisfaction in my soul. The added cherry? I heard her complaining about her left-handed bag to her friend as she walked out with her order, and the confused look on the friend's face was priceless, as this woman idioted and moaned about this completely made-up problem. I never did anything like this before or since. She was a special kind of a-hole, the Karen with the left-handed bag. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Background. I was taking an elective criminal forensic, CSI stuff, night course at a local community college. The best part about taking this course was the instructor, which meant an in-depth tour at the U.S. Criminal Forensic Lab where he worked as the question document examiner. That is, handwriting analysis, signature matching, etc. Also, since computers were barely introduced into forensics at this time, all handwriting analysis matching was done by hand, and this instructor was one of, if not the best, in the world. The MC, as good as I remember, it was a great course studying many facets of criminal forensics and taking the amazing lab tour. As the course was coming to an end, the question document facet approached, the instructor's specialty. At the end of the class, just before it started, the instructor wrote a paragraph on the board, and we each had 2 sheets of blank lined paper. He told us to write the paragraph, only the paragraph, any way we want on one sheet, and then again on the other sheet, trying to disguise our handwriting. "You are committing forgery." The instructor left, and we all started writing. When done, one student, not me, collected all the sheets, mixed them up, and took them to the instructor. We all looked forward to the next class where the instructor would present matched sheets, then explain to us why our forgery attempts failed, and how he would testify in court to prove it. Because I wanted to go home, I made it easy on myself. For my forgery attempt, I wrote the paragraph in print on one sheet and in cursive on the other sheet, even though we were told that it is a failed way to disguise handwriting. Now, for a little background on my handwriting, It's bad. I mean really bad, and I have held pencils, pens wrong since I learned to write. The easiest way to explain it is, I write with a closed fist, right-handed. In elementary school, my parents hired a tutor to try to teach me to write again from scratch, including putting plastic things on pencils to make my preferred grip uncomfortable, but it failed miserably. In high school, I had a teacher tell me I would amount to nothing because I had issues writing legibly. Basically, my print is somewhat legible and my cursive good luck, but that should make no difference? Now back to the story. At the beginning of the next class, the normally happy-go-lucky instructor looked very upset as he walked in. The first words out of his mouth were, if anyone played a practical joke on him, he did not appreciate it. The whole class, about 15 students, looked at each other totally confused. The instructor then again tried to get someone to confess, but we all continued to look confused. The instructor calmed down a little and decided to continue with the class as he would normally have done so. From the stack of papers he was handed at the end of the last class, he picked out the top 2 sheets and said in court speak how he deduced that the same person wrote both paragraphs. Then a student would admit it was their failed forgery attempt, and the instructor would continue with the next 2 sheets. When there were just 2 sheets left, the instructor lifted them up for all the class to see. Looking straight at me, he said he could not testify in court, saying the same person wrote both paragraphs. With a scared look on my face, I said both sheets were mine, and I wrote both paragraphs. So in front of the instructor and the whole class, I again wrote the paragraph, once in print and once in cursive. The instructor walked away, shaking his head and mumbling something like he had never seen this before. After that, the instructor looked at and spoke to me differently, as my classmates created some obvious nicknames for me, for example, the forger. I got an A in the class and was very happy when it ended. The next one is an entitled people story. This happened when I was in middle school, back in the days of wired headphones, so around 2011 or something. I've 24M currently, been a type 1 diabetic since I was about 4 years old, and I use a continuous glucose monitor and an insulin pump. I had an IEP, so all my teachers were told about it, and that I would need my insulin pump in class, that it might make noise, and I might have to pull it out of my pocket and mess with it if I needed insulin, or I might need to drink a juice pouch, and I was able to do so at my discretion. We had one teacher who was a complete hard-ass for no reason. She was notorious for making kids cry during presentations. She even told one girl who wanted to be a doctor to find a cure for cancer, because her little sister had childhood cancer, that she would need to actually be smart to do that while chuckling to herself. Let a kid dream, man. We were like 12 years old. As you can imagine, she was also at war with technology, and on a side note, these days I use my phone to check my glucose and give myself an insulin bolus. I can't imagine being a kid today and dealing with a teacher like that when the lines are blurred, and your smartphone actually is a life-saving medical device. But anyway, if you're not familiar with insulin pumps, the kind I use has a little tube that connects the pump, which has the insulin, to my body, which needs the insulin. This teacher also liked to be weirdly obtuse about things. Instead of being like other teachers and simply saying something like, "No cell phones in class, put it on my desk," which would allow me to remind them it's an insulin pump, and they'd usually say something like, "That's right, my bad," she would instead try to talk abstractly about what she wanted to happen while walking around the room. So this particular day, she kept alluding to students listening to music in class, that you should be careful what you do because she can see it, that us kids think we're so sneaky, but the adults know what we're up to. I obviously wasn't listening to music, so I figured she'd seen someone with headphones in the room, and the next thing I know, she had snuck up behind me with scissors. It took me a good moment to realize what exactly had happened because I was astonished. I was used to teachers thinking I had a cell phone or getting upset about my pump beeping during an exam, but no one had ever touched it before, much less cut my life-sustaining tube. I was actually sitting with my mouth agape, and she turned to me, now that she was at the front of the class again, and said something along the lines of, "Mr. Wunderly, care to share what tunes are more important than listening to class?" At this point, I had put together that she thought I was listening to music. She thought she cut my headphone wires. I replied, "Just the sound of my thoughts while I've still got any, since that was my insulin pump." She had to let me go to my locker to get my cell phone to call my mom to bring me a new infusion set. My parents insisted no cell phones until high school. But my mom was also scared with me being T1D and too dyslexic to remember a phone number, and she wanted me to easily be able to call her, so she got me a $15 Walmart phone and put minutes on it. And now I feel old. Then I just waited in the front office for her. She worked from home and drove like a bat out of hell. She was so angry. I don't ever want to see her that angry again in my life. It took 10 years off of me, and I wasn't even in trouble. The teacher apologized to me, and all the teachers got some more disability accommodation training or something. Kinda anticlimactic end, but a friend thought it was entertaining and that I should share. The next one is an entitled people story. The McCready family farm has been my whole life ever since I was just a young boy. My great-granddaddy founded this place way back in 1912, carved it out of raw prairie with nothing but his bare, calloused hands and a whole lot of grit. 200 acres of good Iowa farmland, nurtured by generations of McCreadys ever since. My daddy worked it, his daddy before him, and now it's my turn. I've spent every day of my 57 years on this soil, watching the seasons change as surely as the sun rises and sets. When I was just a tyke, I'd follow my Grandpa Amos around like a shadow. He'd let me ride along while he plowed and planted, explaining the cycles of life unfolding in the dirt. I'd help Grandma Lily collect eggs from the chicken coop, giggling as the birds pecked curiously at my small fingers. At night, I'd fall asleep in my creaky metal bed listening to the soft lowing of the dairy cows Dad kept back then. The farm seeped into my bones, becoming part of me. My wife Betty and I raised our 3 kids here too, taught them the same enduring values that Grandpa Amos passed on to me. The dignity of a hard day's work, the importance of stewardship, leaving the land better than you found it, and most of all, fierce loyalty to family. I saw those lessons take root as surely as the corn in our south field. Even after the kids moved away, Betty and I stayed on. We scaled back the dairy operation, switched mostly to corn and soybeans now, and we kept a small flock of chickens for meat and eggs. It was a simple, quiet life, just the 2 of us rattling around in the old farmhouse enjoying the fruits of our labor. That all started changing a few years ago when Culver's Creek, the big suburban development, went in right along our property line. I can't say I was thrilled to see all those cookie-cutter houses springing up on old Patterson land just downhill from us, but Betty convinced me it was progress, and we should be neighborly. Initially, the families moving into Culver's Creek didn't cause us any grief. I'd exchange pleasant waves with minivans full of kids as I drove the tractor down the rural route. Let folks hike the trails along the creek that wound through our back pastures. No sense being ornery just for the sake of it. Live and let live. But then that damned homeowners association went and elected Tom Wilson president. Right from the get-go, I could tell he was bad news. Pushy and arrogant. One of those types who always think they know best. I took an instant dislike to him, and the feeling was mutual. The first hint of trouble came when Tom approached me one Sunday after church, flashing his pearly white politician's smile. He wanted to discuss building a road through our south pasture to connect the development directly to the highway. Claimed it would reduce traffic congestion and boost property values. A win-win, he said. Not gonna happen, I told him bluntly. Our farm wasn't going to be carved up for his convenience. Tom's smile evaporated. He turned red and started blustering about eminent domain lawsuits, taking what he wanted no matter what I said. I stood my ground and repeated the only answer he was going to get. No. I hoped that would be the end of it. But Tom Wilson wasn't a man accustomed to taking no for an answer. The following Monday morning, I awoke before dawn to the rumble of heavy machinery outside. Peering out the window, I saw bulldozers plowing a road right through our south pasture. That rat Wilson had sent work crews in while we slept to try forcing the issue. If I wasn't so enraged, I would have been impressed by the audacity. I threw on my boots and stormed outside, yelling for them to stop. But the foreman just glanced my way and kept right on digging. Then up roared Tom Wilson in his shiny black SUV. He strolled over with that infuriating grin, smug as could be. "Morning, neighbor. Just a little road work for the public good. Don't worry yourself about it." I pointed to the no trespassing signs and demanded he halt the construction immediately. "You're wasting your breath," Tom snorted. "This is happening one way or another. I'm not going to let one stubborn old-timer like you stand in the way of progress." Before I could explode, Betty came running out and put a calming hand on my shoulder. She'd already called our lawyer, she said. I needed to stand firm but avoid anything rash. With effort, I swallowed my anger and nodded. "Mark my words, Wilson," I said coldly. "This ain't over." I meant what I said. First thing the next morning, I drove my Caterpillar out to the half-finished road, and I spent the next 2 hours slowly, methodically using the backhoe to dig trenches across the entire thing, rendering it totally impassable. Just try and use this road now, you snake, I thought with grim satisfaction. Another flashy black SUV came tearing up our driveway that afternoon. Wilson exploded out of it, purple with rage. "What the hell did you do?" he screamed, gesturing to the ruined road. "Do you have any idea what this is going to cost me, you senile old fart? I'll sue you into bankruptcy for this. You're finished, McCready." I didn't flinch. "I told you yesterday, and I'm telling you now, that's my land. I'll do with it as I please. There won't be any road through here without my say-so, and in case I wasn't clear before, the answer is no." Wilson was apoplectic now. His hand disappeared inside his suit jacket and re-emerged clutching a small pistol. Before I could react, he pressed the muzzle hard beneath my chin. "You listen to me, you worthless piece of trash!" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Either those trenches get filled back in and this road gets finished, or I'll splatter your idiot brains all over this field right now." I forced myself to stay calm, staring back into his hate-filled eyes. "Go ahead then, but if you do, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, and this land will still never belong to you." For a long, terrible moment, I thought he might actually pull the trigger, but finally Wilson's shoulders sagged, and he let the gun drop to his side. He knew I was right. "This isn't over, old man," he muttered sullenly. "You'll pay for this." I watched him passively as he climbed into his SUV and sped away. My hands didn't start shaking until he was out of sight. Word got around quick about the confrontation. The sheriff paid me a visit that evening, took my statement. They picked up Wilson a few hours later and hit him with assault, trespassing, and weapons charges. Last I heard, he was looking at 5 years minimum. As for me, I took satisfaction in watching the county road crew rip up and remove every bit of Wilson's pathetic little road. Betty and I celebrated with a glass of sweet tea on the front porch that night. Tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, as it always had. But tonight justice had been served, and our precious family land was safe once more. The next one is a pro-revenge story. So Mary started working for a college 5 years ago as an administrative assistant. She was given odd and end tasks, one of which was writing up the school handbook. She noted in the handbook that staff were required to take time for professional development. After some years and a few promotions, she lands a manager position in the department and spearheads an initiative to have all staff under her have approved time to attend professional development conferences. Karen always rejected this idea, but Mary decided one day to go to Karen's boss. We will call him Bob. Bob is great. Once Mary has enough weight in the college, she went around Karen and got Bob to approve conferences for everyone in the department. For the next year or so, everyone got to choose any conference around the continental USA to attend on the company's dime. Everyone would come back with notes taken at every session attended, attached with a conference itinerary, and given to their direct superior as proof of attendance. The employee would also present key points learned from their conference at a weekly departmental meeting. It was a pretty simple morale-boosting opportunity, until someone had to abuse it. Karen had been bragging to other department directors as well as to Mary about swimming with dolphins during her recent travel to a conference. Mary didn't think much of it, as usually there was sometimes a free morning or afternoon to do as you please at these conferences. My wife told me this during our nightly pillow talk, and having been raised in Orlando, where Karen decided to attend a conference, my head popped up and I asked, "Where?" Mary replied with a well-known location run by a well-known company with a whale for a logo. I quickly replied, "They close at 5:30. When did Karen have time for this?" Mary, who had access to Karen's itinerary, dropped her jaw when she realized the conference Karen attended did not have free time during the business hours of the dolphin swimming experience. Mary went into an enraged clerical fury as she pulled up Karen's full travel itinerary for flight, hotel, conference, and other reimbursements. The school does most departmental work online, and therefore the school's server can be accessed remotely from secured or approved devices like Mary's phone. She also checked the website where Karen went swimming to confirm the hours of operation. According to the record submitted, there was no way Karen had time to swim with dolphins during the experience's normal business hours without missing part of this conference. According to Karen's itinerary, she was supposed to have attended all sessions. Mary worked hard to have the privilege to travel the country to attend conferences, and Karen just messed it all up. Mary eventually wrote all of this up, attached the itinerary documents, attached photos of the encounter, and apparently from other theme parks that Karen had neglected to mention, from social media, attached the hours of operation, and sent all of this to Bob. Mary texted me about an hour after she got to work the next day, saying Bob was livid. He was currently in the process of questioning everyone Karen had bragged to see if the stories all matched up. A few days later, Karen was fired from the company for only attending one session of the 3-day conference, lying about her filed report, using company funds for travel, hotel, and food to go play at theme parks, and for submitting a time card to get paid while doing all of that. Although Mary's name was anonymous throughout all of this, Karen seemed to blame Mary anyways. Karen sent mean and dark texts to Mary several times until the school could send a cease and desist. Worse of all, I guess Karen's husband was a deadbeat. So not only did Karen have to trade in her massive SUV for a smaller vehicle, she had also just signed on a new house only days before she was fired and now had no income to support the said home. I'm not completely cynical, people shouldn't be homeless, but Karen had also taken credit for a lot of Mary's work, made Mary do Karen's workload while Karen went AFK, and many other instances of foul play I can't remember because there's so much pillow talk. Needless to say, Karen reaped what she sowed. The next one is a petty revenge story. On a day I was off work, I was craving a sandwich at lunchtime on a hot day. I traveled to the nearest subway and got in line. As it was noontime, there were quite a few people in line, and as many places they seemed understaffed. I get that everyone is doing the best they can. The young teenage girl was the only one making sandwiches while a manager was ringing up the orders when not helping with condiments. So, while waiting in line at Subway with about 6 others, I was behind a group of 3 old ladies, the Karens of this story. While not the spitting image of most Karens, you could tell from how they talked with each other they were the kind of women with resting bitch faces. So it came time to have their sandwiches made, and of course every one of them wanted a very custom sandwich. This meat, that cheese, is a little too much. I want it toasted more. That is too much. I want to switch the bread. On and on, it was annoying as the girl tried to keep up but was getting frustrated and stressed. Then the manager stepped over, trying to help, but with these women, they were not happy with anything. After 15 minutes of making each of these ladies sandwiches, it finally came time to pay. Down to the register they went as my meatball sub was quickly made and passed down. I am plain bread, meat, and sauce, a little ranch, so I waited behind them. The manager rang up the old ladies, and when the total came out to around $30, they went off again. I'm not saying that they started to squeal. We waited forever to be served, and then you two couldn't even make a sandwich. We want it free, they whined. I was fed up with it, and after it continued for a few minutes, I stepped up and said I'd take the sandwiches and add them to mine. The old ladies grinned and thought they had won. I paid for the 4 sandwiches now and added my drink and chips. After my card was approved and I was handed my receipt, I picked up my newly purchased sandwiches and got my drink. As I started leaving, the old ladies went to sit at a table. After getting my drink, I headed to the door to leave with my food in hand. Excuse me, you still have our food. Are you not going to bring it to us? One of them held up the receipt. Nope, I paid my money for my food and will take them back to work, I replied as I headed to the door. This got the old ladies to get up and chase me out the door, which I didn't mind. The staff had enough of them, and I can take some abuse from crazies. You need to give us our food or we will call the cops and have you arrested, one of them threatened. I knew this was dumb, but as I said, nothing better to do on a day off. Please be my guest. I assure you they won't be doing anything about this, I calmly responded. One of them started to pull out a phone and call while the others began telling me how I must love stealing from old ladies and how they knew this person or that person and I would be in jail for a long time. Well, they called. I stood there not saying a word, which is hard to do when being belittled. But I had the store crowd watching by this point. Soon enough, a few units pulled in, and as they got out, a look of confusion crossed their faces. Officer, are you the guy they called about because you matched the description? Me. Yeah, I am who they called on. Officer. You stole their sandwiches and demanded money from them. Me. Well, look into it. Ask the clerk and manager who paid for the sandwiches, and look at this receipt. One officer walked into the store, spoke with the staff, and watched the video while the other listened to these women insinuate that I took the food from them. The shock was priceless once the other officer came out and confirmed I paid for them, and the store also wanted the 3 of them trespassed for causing a disturbance. I was released to leave, but decided to go back in and eat. The 3 women were banned and left with an even more sour look, and the manager brought over a cookie, telling me it was on her. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I used to work at Sonic as a car hop. I usually worked from 4 or 5 until closing. One day, I was cleaning up all the drinks the day shift left behind, and I found a can of Monster. I grabbed it and walked around asking everybody who was working. The manager, Robert as usual, was talking to his girlfriend on the phone, based on the conversation content. When I asked if it was his, he looked right at me, shook his head, and turned away without saying anything. After I finished asking everybody else, I dumped it out and threw it away. 30 to 45 minutes later, he came up front and went to throw away his trash. He saw it in the trash. He was livid. He started screaming, grabbed it out of the trash, and shoved it in people's faces, asking if they threw it away. I told him they didn't. I did. He cornered me against the wall and screamed in my face that I was going to leave and buy him a new one. Two things. The monster can was probably half full, if that. And I hate being yelled at. Besides, I had asked him. We got into this huge fight about it, with him demanding that I replace it and me telling him to duck off. This went on for 2 hours. It was slow because it was winter, so he sent everybody else home. He was cooking. Finally, he told me I was either going to buy a new one or go home. It was 7 o'clock at this point, and we closed at midnight. I grabbed my stuff and went to clock out. He said if I didn't go get him a new drink, I was fired. I said, "Okay, see you never." Not even 5 minutes after I left, the GM, Jeremy, called me asking why I left. So I told him what happened. He said the other manager couldn't fire me, as only the GM had that authority, and asked me to go back and finish the shift. I told him I couldn't do that with Robert yelling in my face like that and that I would return the next day. So Robert was stuck for the rest of the night. Nobody else, not even Jeremy, would come in. He had to cook and run orders by himself for 5 hours. It pissed off a lot of customers. When I went in the next night, he asked why I was back since he had fired me, and it was a joy to tell him he couldn't do that. He held a grudge for 3 whole months. The next one is an entitled People Story. I'm 29 and I had been dealing with this for some time, but recently it became ridiculous. My grandmother is the most special person I ever knew. And by special, I mean one of the most frustrating, entitled, narcissistic, condescending idiots on earth. She believes that she is the matriarch of the family, the highest authority that we all must obey. And for that, she has done a lot of things to the whole family over the years. And recently I became her main objective. A couple of months ago, she organized a family meeting at her house, thinking it was just a family meal. We all went, and when everyone was there, she revealed her true intentions. It was a trap. Apparently, someone told my grandmother that I was dating a girl, my girlfriend, and basically, she exposed me to the entire family. At that moment, I hadn't even told my parents about it yet. The following 30 minutes were a non-stop humiliation in front of my entire family, with her saying how much of a failure I was, a shame to the family, a sinner, and how embarrassed she was that all her church friends knew I was a shameless pervert. When I couldn't take her crap anymore, I got up from my chair, only to be slapped in the face by her for disrespecting her. After seeing that, the rest of the family finally intervened, pulling her away before she tried to pull my hair. In the following weeks, she was nothing more than a constant headache, endless calls and text messages telling me such beautiful things as how I will burn for my sins, that I was a disgrace, that I should stop fooling around and correct my life. She even lectured my parents, demanding that they correct me, make me quit my job and find a husband because that was the right thing to do and what I should be doing. Also, she took every chance she got to say how evil and selfish I was for ruining her good image. Last Saturday, she outdid herself. While I was in my apartment, there was a knock on the door, and when I opened it, I saw that it was her. By that point, I was no longer trying to hide my displeasure from her, and I just said, "Ah, it's you. What do you want?" Without being invited to come in, she went into my house, began to look around the place with an obvious gesture of disgust and disapproval on her face, and then turned to look at me with that look of superiority, as if she were doing me a favor just by being there. She told me that she had already given me more than enough time to reconsider and correct my life, so she was there so that I could apologize to her. I just laughed sarcastically, and told her that she was crazy and that she could go now. She then started lecturing me with the same speech again, but I didn't take it. I interrupted her and let out all the things I've wanted to tell her for a long time. That she was a stupid old witch, that she was not an authority figure to anyone, that her presence alone ruins our day, that nobody can stand her, that she is such a horrible and suffocating grandmother and mother, that she should not find it strange that none of her children love her or visit her unless she forces them to. I knew I had hurt her by the way she tensed her face and how she tried to hide the tears in her eyes. It was then that she said, "Enough. I can see that you don't understand the good way, so I will have to correct you in the old way. Give me the keys to this place. You will return to your parents, and you will be grounded until you learn to obey and do what I ordered." I still had the keys in my hand from when I opened the door, to which she extended her hand, as if waiting for me to give them to her. I laughed. I laughed out loud. This was too ridiculous that I couldn't take it seriously, and apparently that made her so mad that she lunged at me, trying to grab my keys. We struggled, there were screams, things falling out of place. The damn witch even got to the point of digging her nails into my arms and biting my hands. The scandal was such that a couple of neighbors went out to see what was going on, and when my grandmother saw them, she started shouting that I was a thief and was trying to rob her house. Obviously, they didn't believe her. They were my neighbors, they knew me. They separated her from me, and when she saw that they did not believe her and that I would not obey her, she threatened me with, "Your parents will know about this," and left. Since then, she has been telling everyone how I insulted her and violently attacked her. We all know her. We all know she is a liar. She just makes everyone's lives harder. The next one is an entitled people story. I never imagined I'd wake up one morning to the roar of bulldozers and excavators tearing up my backyard. The shrill beeps and rumble of heavy machinery jolted me out of bed. I rushed to the window, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A huge construction crew swarming over the back half of my property, ripping down the fence and uprooting my trees. What in the world? I threw on some clothes and sprinted outside, waving my arms. "Hey! What's going on here? You can't do this!" The construction workers glanced my way but continued their work. I hurried over to the man operating the bulldozer. "Stop this right now! This is my property!" The man just shrugged and said, "Talk to the lady in charge. I'm just doing my job." I scanned the scene until I spotted a prim woman in a pantsuit scrutinizing a clipboard. I stormed up to her. "Excuse me, who are you? And what gives you the right to destroy my land?" She gave me an icy stare. "I'm Susan Worthington, president of the Homeowners Association's board. The board approved plans for a new commercial parking lot here months ago. This portion of the land belongs to the Homeowners Associations per our records." I stood there, mouth agape in shock. A parking lot? On my property? Without my permission? "I'm sorry," I said, trying to stay calm, "but this is my private property as deeded to me 5 years ago when I bought this place. There must be some mistake." Susan's lips pressed into a thin line as she shook her head. "No. According to Homeowners Association's documents from the 80s, we own rights to this section for development. It's out of your hands." She dismissed me with a wave and headed off, yelling instructions to the demolition crew. I hurried back inside and rifled through my office drawer until I found it, my deed and title. As I suspected, it clearly showed my ownership of the entire 2-acre parcel, including the back area Susan had referenced. How could the Homeowners Associations claim rights to my land? I had to get to the bottom of this. I called the Homeowners Association's board office on my way to work and left an urgent message demanding to see proof of their supposed land rights. Days passed, but I heard nothing back. All the while, the parking lot construction progressed full steam ahead. My once beautiful property now resembled a dirt pit filled with gravel and cement foundations. My frustration boiled over. I finally marched down to the Homeowners Association's office and wouldn't leave until Susan produced documentation. After making me wait for over an hour, she emerged from the back room holding a few papers. "Here is your proof," she said curtly, thrusting the documents at me. I pored over them and saw they were covenants dated decades ago that purported to grant the Homeowners Association's access to a portion of my property for development purposes. But something seemed off about the typesetting, language, and signatures. I knew I needed professional help. I met with a real estate lawyer, Amanda, who examined the Homeowners Association's documents. Her face turned grim. "Unfortunately, these covenants appear forged. I've seen similar situations where homeowners associations try illegal maneuvers to seize land. We need to act quickly." Together, Amanda and I filed an emergency injunction to halt construction. We had a tense court hearing where Susan and the Homeowners Association's lawyer continued to insist the covenants were legitimate. But Amanda expertly highlighted the multiple discrepancies that indicated forgery. When she presented my proper deed, the judge agreed the Homeowners Associations had clearly overstepped. He ordered an immediate stop to all parking lot work while things got sorted out. I wish I could say the Homeowners Associations backed down gracefully at that point, but instead, they countersued me for construction delays and damages. I guess they didn't expect me to fight back. Amanda hired a private investigator who gathered statements from ex-Homeowners Associations members alleging unethical business practices. Armed with this mounting evidence, Amanda convinced the homeowners associations to drop their suit and settle out of court. Their lawyer knew we had an airtight forgery case. The judge slapped them with massive trespassing penalties, awarded me ownership rights to the disputed land, and even made their president, Susan, resign. In the end, I chose not to sue for damages, wanting to put the whole ordeal behind me. The homeowners associations did pay for removal of the partially built parking lot materials so I could restore my backyard. This experience taught me homeowners need to vigilantly guard their property rights against even seemingly respectable associations. I'm just relieved I caught their fraudulent land grab in time. My advice: always insist on transparency and accountability from homeowners associations. They are not above the law, no matter how much they try to bend the rules. I fought for what was rightfully mine and emerged the victor against all odds. The next one is a pro-revenge story. This tale of nuclear revenge happened a while back and is a work in progress. It is too good not to tell, and I will try to keep you updated down the track. Brian's neighbor is a typical greedy career landlord who left their rental house in disrepair. The poor tenant was living in the cold house, with raw sewage leaking onto the lawn, and holes in the house where you could see light coming out. After multiple requests from Brian, Karen refused to get any repairs done. When the state government introduced new laws about ensuring landlords are insulating their rental properties instead of doing this to the house, Karen kicked out her tenant and left the house vacant for 5 years. The old house deteriorated even more during this time, with rats infesting the house and invading other houses nearby. Brian and his wife, with their limited funds, were able to get sufficient lending from the bank and offered to buy the house and fix it up themselves to improve the neighborhood or rent it out, as there is a massive shortage of rental properties in our local county. Greedy Karen did not want to sell, nor did she want to spend a cent on the house to remedy the rodent problem. She also did not care about the effect the house was having on the aesthetics of the street. It is important to know that Karen and her wealthy family have over 100 rental properties, and due to lax tax laws in this region, they do not pay a cent and can get tax write-offs when their properties deteriorate. They can claim this as a loss. Long story short, some of them appear to be leeches on our society and are one of the reasons property prices are so high and rent prices are skyrocketing in our area. Her husband is also the chairman of the state's Landlords Association, an association that he often fronts the media for, defending landlords and putting a good media spin on them when there is negative press. Fast forward 5 years and Brian finds out the house is going to be demolished to make way for some new houses on the small section. That's good news, at least, though Brian and his wife were anxious about how smoothly the demolition would go due to the fact that the houses are quite close to each other. This is important for later. Prior to demolition, the company doing it had to get samples from all sides of the house to check for asbestos. Either Karen made it difficult for the company to get down the side bordering Brian's house, or they simply were too lazy, but only samples from 3 sides, not 4, were taken. Demolition day came around, and Brian was concerned that no safety barriers had been put up to protect his house from falling bricks from the chimney, nor was there anything to stop dust and debris from going all over his new deck and porch area. Later that day, Brian had the pleasure of meeting Keith. Keith is the demolition company manager who is well known around the district for only caring about money and having little regard for people or property. Keith was doing the demolition himself that day simply with a digger. Brian returned home during his break at work to check the progress of the demolition, and found that the demolition was already complete after only an hour or so. The demolished house was in a pile. He climbed up on his roof and, to his disbelief, found hundreds of bricks had fallen onto his roof, causing damage, though he was lucky that none had fallen through into the house. Brian phoned up demolition man Keith to ask about what went wrong. Keith initially played down the damage despite there being 200 bricks laying on Brian's roof. Even with the damage done, no apology, and the rude attitude of Keith, Brian kept his cool. "Since I did a little bit of roofing when I was younger, I can fix up the roof if you just get me 4 new sheets of roofing iron, and we will call it even. Don't worry about paying for paint, I can sort that out when I paint the whole roof after the fall." Brian's roof was not in the best of shape, but it was in much worse shape after having bricks dumped on it, leaving massive dents and chipping the paint. This is the moment that a simple decision on Keith's part would screw him and the landlord big time. "Not happening, pal. Your roof is messed up anyway. I'll get you a sheet of second-hand roofing iron from my yard to repair the damage on the roof, and I can come and hose off the dust off your deck and dog kennel." Cue the nuclear revenge. The revenge was not intentionally nuclear, but Brian had a dilemma. His roof was damaged and he needed it repaired. There was rain and snow forecast later in the week, and he shouldn't be out of pocket having to buy new materials to fix his own roof up to a good standard. Brian is normally a calm and relaxed man, but this situation and the way he and his property were treated sparked an anger that I have never seen before. Brian got in contact with his insurance company, and due to the issue involving a roof, a building assessor arrived that day to assess the claim. The assessor would then be able to seek damages from the landlord or demolition company if he found them to be at fault. Brian also reported the demolition company to the local health and safety authorities due to their lack of safety precautions used during the demolition. The assessor got onto the roof with Brian and was mortified to hear how Keith had acted with such disregard for the damage done to the roof and his lack of an apology for any wrongdoing. It got the assessor mad. He then looked more concerned, bent down, and picked up some gray fibrous material. Luckily, thanks to COVID, we already have masks on, Brian. This here looks like it is asbestos. I don't know how they got the sign-off to get this house knocked down in this manner. You don't know at the time of being exposed to this stuff, but if you breathe in these fibers, it can cause serious diseases later on in life, including lung cancer. I'll get this sent off to the lab for testing and we'll be in touch. Fast forward another day, and Brian was contacted by his insurance company. It turns out the side of the house that wasn't tested was clad in asbestos. Not just any bad asbestos, but the worst possible type you can get. Insurance will be seeking damages to replace Brian's whole roof, not just the damaged part. The cost of replacement is likely to be around $20,000. This is the cheap part. The demolition site has been shut down by local authorities, and there needs to be a massive decontamination of the area. This involves removing at least half a meter of topsoil on surrounding properties, testing the soil, and removing more if asbestos is still found. Areas with decks may need to have them removed so the soil can be evacuated from underneath. The cost for this cleanup will likely be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but who will pay for this is unknown at this stage. Whether it is Keith or Karen's insurance or them personally, time will tell. Regarding Brian, his family, and their dog potentially being exposed to the asbestos, that is another battle for them to fight, and I will keep you updated. Update 1. I've just been on the phone with Brian for half an hour. His workplace was very sympathetic and paid for him to have 2 days off to try to sort things out. This is in complete contrast to Karen and Keith, who are yet to apologize and have made life difficult for Brian and his family. Due to the neighboring property being closed off for entry due to the health and safety investigation, Brian cannot even get scaffolding on his roof yet to fix it. Brian is worried now that the landlord is going to try to make his life hell. She is also a lawyer, apparently. Karen was the person who offered the old roofing iron, apparently, not Keith. She spoke to her husband, who said that because the bricks dented the roof, it must have been rusty and old, so it doesn't need new iron put on. Keith, however, went nuts at Brian for getting insurance involved, and also the Health and Safety Investigation Unit, who are currently conducting the investigation. Regarding Brian and his family still living in the house, according to the investigator, the risk is negligible, and the problems will arise when the debris is removed from the section. This will require a large tent, etc. However, the wind has been strong in the last few days, and I feel the risk is still high living next door to uncovered broken asbestos cladding that is not being kept damp. Brian asked the investigation office person by phone about what to do about his dog and if they needed a vet checkup, etc. They were 1 meter away from the fence, which is about a foot from the asbestos when it was broken up. They responded saying, "Do you think your dog will live more than 20 years? If not, I probably wouldn't worry." Brian also thinks the landlord is probably scheming revenge of her own. Brian paid for a new fence himself a few years back to border Karen's rental. When he moved in, the old fence was half falling down, and she refused to pay half, despite this being the law. He reckons that because the fence is approximately 10 centimeters too high, she will ask him to cut the height down at his own cost, so it is in the perfect position for her new houses that are to be built. Brian's plan is that he will pull the nice expensive fence down entirely and put up 600 high chicken wire mesh, as this is all that is required by law, and there is nothing she can do about it legally since he paid for and built the fence. I will continue to keep you all updated. Also, as I know the local newspaper editor, I have offered to go with Brian to discuss this story with them once the investigation is completed, if Karen tries to make life difficult, and also expose Keith for his dirty practices. Keith's company has just been awarded a multi-million-dollar contract for the demolition of an old car factory, and this would raise some eyebrows. Update 2. A very small update, but not great news. I feel this story, as many have suggested, will not conclude with a warm, fuzzy feeling of ultimate revenge as things progress. Firstly, Brian informed me that a fence has gone up around the exposed parts of the neighboring property. This is only to stop people from the public going over to the debris pile and scavenging, etc., and then exposing themselves to the broken asbestos cladding. Brian also needed to take 2 full days off work when this happened to try to sort out the situation and reduce stress on his wife, talking with all parties involved. So he was down 2 days' wages coming up to Christmas, but his kind boss has paid him special leave for taking them off. The insurance company, after further clarification, will only be paying out for 1/4 of the roof and flashings. Brian will have to find funds to pay for the rest. This section of the roof is, however, the most expensive, as it encompasses a large complex parapet gutter, roofing iron, and flashings. Cost? $8,000. I hope I can provide something more substantial in a later update when there has been more action. Update 3. Wish this update was actually something to update you on, but alas, it is merely to say that due to the Christmas break, etc., nothing has progressed. Brian cannot get his roof fixed until the area beside his house is decontaminated so the scaffolding can then go up. Update 4. Another downer of an update. Brian is being paid $8,000 towards his roof. The landlord contractor got away with not needing a huge area cleanup and convinced local authorities that the building site would be sufficient for decontamination, as the testers could not find samples over the fences of surrounding houses. All topsoil on the old section was removed and replaced. A new house has been quickly built by the landlord's builder. The house looks as cheap as they come, a kit-set house, and looks out of place. Sort of like a house you could load onto a truck and move if needed in the future. Brian still hasn't had his roof fixed yet, as he needs to save money to afford to pay for the whole roof. Update 5. Brian tells me the demolition company is taking his insurance company to court over the amount they have to pay for the roof. The next one is a petty revenge story. We recently bought a new cat tower. We have 5 cats who play hard, and the old tower was definitely showing signs of use. The cats had torn up the carpet and sisal, vomited in one of the cubes, and decapitated the hanging mouse whose name is Earl, because why not? We set up the new tower, and after asking around to our friends, we couldn't find anyone who wanted it, so we took it out to the curb to get rid of it. Large trash pickup was coming up, so we figured if anyone wanted it, they would have plenty of time to grab it before trash pickup. In our neighborhood, as long as the item is not on the curb for more than a week, you won't get cited for having trash in your yard. No big deal, right? Oh no, it's a big deal because Karen and Kevin have decided they want the tower. I work from home, but my office is in the back of my house. We have a Ring camera, and around 10 a.m. one morning, the doorbell rings. I am in a meeting with my boss, so I check the app, see that I don't know who these people, Kevin and Karen, are, and go back to my meeting. About 45 minutes later, the doorbell rings again. Now I'm out of my meeting, and since I'm expecting packages, I check the app, see that it's the delivery guy, and then head out front to grab my packages off the porch. I hear the notification going off on my phone as I'm opening the door, and there stand Kevin and Karen with my packages and the cat tower. Kevin is holding my packages. Me. Can I help you? Kevin. We are interested in the cat tower. Me. Go for it. It's been left out for large trash. You can have it. May I have my packages, please? Karen. The carpet and the sisal on the tower are torn. I'm going to need you to fix that before we take the tower. And there's vomit on it. That needs to be cleaned as well. Me. I'm not going to fix anything on the tower. We are throwing it away. If you want the tower, take the tower. If not, it will be picked up later this week with large trash. Now may I please have my packages? Kevin, obviously realizing I'm not concerned at all about the state of the cat tower. Well, we still want the cat tower. I'm just going to leave it on your porch, and we will come back with our truck this weekend and pick it up. He is still holding my damn packages. Me, that won't work for us. See, we are trying to get rid of the tower, and I don't want it on my porch, which is why it's on the curb. So if you want the tower and you aren't going to take it right now, I'm not going to hold it for you. Please give me my packages. About this time, my phone started ringing, and I needed to get back to work. But I wasn't going to leave without my packages. Just as I am about to get angry with these people, my retired military, grizzled biker-looking neighbor pulls up in his pickup truck. He is a big pussycat, but very protective of us, and especially our 2 daughters. My neighbor calls over to me and starts heading over to where we are standing on my porch. I guess Kevin got nervous, so at that point he shoved my packages at me and then said, Well, just leave the tower on the porch, and we will pick it up when we can. Yeah, that's not going to work for me. And when Kevin and Karen walk off, I turn to my neighbor and asked him to help me carry the damn cat tower back down to the curb. A little while later, I had to run an errand, and when I got back, the stupid cat tower was back on my porch. Y'all, what the absolute stupid hell? My kid, F19, got back from class a little while later and asked why the cat tower is back on the porch. I told her the story, she rolled her eyes and groaned, and I went back to work. About 30 minutes later, she came into my office laughing. Me, what did you do? MK, took the cat tower back down to the curb. Me, how? That thing is heavy as hell. MK, it was really easy once I took it apart and put all the hardware in this Ziploc bag that accidentally fell into the trash can with the used cat litter. So if Kevin and Karen want the cat tower, it's still available, but they will have to go dumpster diving for the hardware. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So I was at this hotel lobby, sitting there waiting to go to a restaurant. All of a sudden, 2 cops show up, ask me for ID, and then tell me I have to leave because a lady had complained that she didn't feel comfortable with me there. It was a total Karen call. One cop was kind of a jerk, too. He tells me I have to leave until they let me back. They stare at me as I walk to my car. I'm not sure what it was. I was wearing a political slogan shirt, but nothing vulgar. Later, I call the hotel and ask to speak with a manager who then explains that some guest had called and she was kind of a Karen, so they wanted to make her happy. The manager said I'm welcome to come back to the property. I was reluctant to give them business again, but I couldn't let the cops or the Karen win. I go back to the hotel and sit at the restaurant. I call the police department and inform them that I got permission to return. The dispatcher is aggravated and says he is required to send an officer to check. The same cop who was there earlier returns and gives me the evil look. He goes to the front desk, speaks to the manager who waves me to the front. The cop pulls out a form that he has to fill out and the manager reviews it and signs it. It was a trespass removal form. Both seemed very annoyed to have to go through the process, but it's the law. The cop storms out, aggravated, as I smile and say, "Enjoy the day." The manager of the restaurant gives me a sort of smile and says I didn't have to call the cops back as it was just extra paperwork. But I wanted to comply with the policies, haha. I think I may have seen the Karen walk out, giving me a mean look as I was in the restaurant. I enjoyed the rest of my meal. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.